Welcome into the Energy Tech Podcast presented by Opsite Energy. Today, we're filming live from ENTELEC 2026, and we are excited to welcome Dale Peterson with S4 Events. Guys, welcome to Galveston.
Hey, Jeff, it is good to be here. I'm your co-host with the Energy Tech Podcast, Mike Flores, right here in lovely Galveston, Texas, as part of ENTELEC 2026. And we have one of our great guests and today's keynote speaker, Mr. Dale Peterson. Dale, thank you for joining us here as part of the Energy Tech Podcast.
Oh, my pleasure.
Oh, it's great to have you. You know, I think what a lot of folks don't know is not just your keynote, and there's a reason why. And I want to touch on a couple of things. Number one, Dale, I know that you're the founder and CEO of Digital Bond, where you focus 100% on ICS and SCADA Cybersecurity, right? Is that kind of a fair deal about you?
And for the last 25 years.
Yeah. And, you know, having done that, this meant that probably the last 25 years, early on, just before 2000, how did you get pulled into ICS and SCADA?
Dumb luck. I just stumbled into it. We were doing cybersecurity. A large water utility contacted us and said, can you do a SCADA security assessment? Excuse me. And being a consultant, of course, we said yes, even though I didn't know what SCADA was. And luckily it was water, and water is pretty forgiving. So we stumbled into it, and it was so interesting being able to actually see how real systems work.
Right.
And I just fell in love with it. And then from that point on, we got more and more involved. And by 2003, it's all we were doing.
Yeah, and it appears to me that you created S4 in about 2007. What drove that, man?
Well, one of the people on my team found a vulnerability in an ICCP protocol. It's a protocol in the electric industry they use to communicate between the various companies and sites. And I said, well, you should present this somewhere. And he said, well, there's nowhere where they both understand security and understand ICS.
Yeah.
So I said, okay, well, let's create such a thing so you can give a presentation there. And it was an effort at the beginning to build the community. Because back in 2007, there really weren't many people doing this. I mean, the room we had, most of the people in the world that did this, and there was maybe 45 people in the room.
You know, I think you're right. I think that, you know, even in a lot of companies today, sometimes cybersecurity efforts in OT or ICS sometimes is relegated to the same person that's doing the automation tech and the instrumentation and electrical role. It's like, hey, you might need to protect your network. Here's what we're going to do, right? So you'll find that is common even for some legacy companies that have OT, ICS.
It's really a problem. Some people refer to it as the cyber poor, the people that, you know, the same person is in charge of the SCADA system, who's in charge of the VP's laptop or things like that. And they're in a tough situation because they are never going to have a sophisticated security program. For a lot of those people, it's mainly having the ability to go back to manual operations if they have to, because they're just not going to have the resources to have the right OT security program.
So when you established S4, which I think was back in about 2007, right?
Yep.
So when you did that, you mentioned the scenario where you first started this, but what kind of gap were you trying to fill? I mean, it's a wide one, but I'm sure there's something that was driving you other than some of the projects you were working on. What kind of gap were you trying to fill at that time?
Well, I started out as a crypto analyst with NSA.
Okay.
And I saw how back in the 80s, back when there wasn't really a crypto community, and I saw how people like Whit Diffie and Ron Rivest and others built that crypto community through events like this, and use that as kind of the community building template for that. And actually our first keynote was with Diffie, and just on that subject, how do you go about building a community where it is needed? Yeah.
And so, you know, out of that, you know, what, if you had to look back to then that you see now, obviously in OT ICS, I agree with you. I think there is some slight positive movement. But what is one of the challenges that is what I call a legacy challenge that remains in the space?
Well, there's so many of them, I think. There is the tendency, this community moves much slower. There's a tendency, the knee-jerk reaction is it won't work in OT.
Yeah.
Whatever you say, it won't work in OT, and it takes longer for us to accept it, whether it be, going way back, Ethernet, Windows, virtualization,
Right.
passive detection. So we get there. I think that's one of the challenges. We still have not, the thing that bothered me, and we did a big effort on this called Project Basecamp in 2012,
Okay.
was the protocols and a lot of the systems are what we call insecure by design. So this is much worse than a lack of security. What it means is that, for example, most of your protocols lack basic authentication.
Yes.
So once you gain access to the system, you can do whatever the system will allow you to do. So it doesn't matter whether you're an attacker or an administrator. Now you need the engineering knowledge, you need the I/O to do it, so you can't do anything. But we're still now, I say 25 years after the birth of the OT security community, and still probably 80% plus of our systems are running insecure by design protocols and systems where access equals compromise.
What do you think that is? You blame that on legacy equipment? Is it something that hasn't caught up? Is it, hey, we believed we're air gapped, so it's no big deal?
Well, it's a lot of things. There's always the argument that it'll take decades to fix. Well, it's been 2 decades now. So I was hearing that in 2005, it'll take decades to fix. It's been decades, and we're still not close. A lot of the problem is we just have not had much consequence to not fixing it. I mean, if you go to the actual asset owner and you say, well, how much loss did you have due to cyber incidents in OT? There are some exceptions where they have had loss, but so far we have, for whatever reason, been lucky that we haven't really suffered. Now, as soon as something big happens because of this, that's more widespread, I would imagine that'll be the impetus to do something.
When you say consequence, do you mean, hey, perhaps there's let's say a nation state attack that really does some major damage? Do you think it's only when you see that type of consequence that you might see some change?
I think it's either that or we get a major technology refresh. So, for example, at some point in the future, containers will come to level 1 devices.
Yeah.
And when that happens, making changes won't be so painful as it is today.
I see.
So I think I'm hopeful that that's the driver, and I'm hopeful that's not too many years away. But of course, you could have the stick as opposed to the
So a
carrot.
good example of that you're thinking is maybe the containerization of the PLC?
Exactly.
Yeah, instead of living at the edge?
Everything but the I/O.
Got it.
And when you think about it, it really makes sense. It's just, when is it going to happen, and will there be enough benefit to accelerate that, as opposed to the normal replacement curve of 15, 20 years for replacing your PLCs, or longer.
Yeah, I had we had some guests. I wanted to stick around for your keynote. One of the things is you gave the keynote address here this morning here at ENTELEC, and you titled it "Connect, Consider, and Consequence." And for me personally, I want to know, how did you land on that? Like, how did you land on that? Obviously, you mentioned a consequence earlier, so I'm trying to draw a connection, but kind of what drew that title?
Well, a lot of it was they said they wanted me to talk for almost an hour, so I couldn't talk about one thing for that long. So there were 3 different things. Because I put together a conference, I don't have any sessions longer than 30 minutes because I think it's really hard to hold people's attention for that long.
Right.
But they're the 3 big things that I see. With Connect, you've got AI, contextual and agentic AI and generative AI is making connections so easy that you're going to see a bunch of systems connecting, and the security community needs to be ready for that. And consider, we're getting long lists of things that they're telling us we need to do that are all good security practices.
Right.
And the security pros that are going to be of value to their companies are the ones that say, out of this list of 100 things, we're going to do these 10.
Right.
And I'm sorry, but we're not going to do these other 90.
Right.
And then the consequence really is, we have found, and it's something I didn't do the first 15 years of my career. It's probably the biggest mistake I made, is you can sometimes achieve much more risk reduction by reducing the consequence of someone who has gotten into your system.
I see.
So an attacker with complete control, if they can't cause that high consequence event by some unhackable safety protection measure or second source something, you can make a big difference. So it was really three different thoughts that weren't terribly tied together, but they were three things that I thought were important.
Well, I was doing a little bit of homework, and you, in one of your previous conferences, you've mentioned maybe someone that's a CISO not using the word CISO. And how do you balance that? Because you just said right there, Mike, there's, you really want to balance that. So how does a CISO or someone do that, particularly in the OT space, to ensure that they're being enablers and not just saying no?
Well, what I'm seeing more and more, especially, and this kind of tied to the Connect theme, the benefits are so great. And I don't care what sector you're in. Here we are with petrochem, but you can go to almost any sector. If the benefits are enough, the CISO can't say no. Right. The C-levels will say, find a way to do it.
Is that benefit or risk? I mean, how do you look at the two?
Well, benefit to the business. So the business will make this much more money, be this much more profitable, get this growth, get these new customers. At some level, they're not going to let security stand in the way, but they're going to expect you to find a way to reduce the risk so it is acceptable to them.
Yeah. And, how do you or your group or anyone else push that to, you mentioned this earlier, that OT poor. In other words, a lot of times, we work with clients as well that that cyber hygiene is relegated to an automation tech that doesn't spend as much devoted cyber training as his counterpart that might be in IT infrastructure, right? I tend to see that they don't receive the same level of cyber hygiene or technique training a lot of times. How do you bridge that?
Well, I don't think you are going to bridge it. If you don't have the resources, you don't have the resources. You might get some increase, but what we've seen, it's one of the things that I think CISA and the U.S. government has gotten wrong, is you'll see a great example is small water. A small water utility gets hit.
Yes.
And they're in that example where they've got a couple people, if they're lucky, for all of their IT, let alone no IT security department, no OT security department. Right. The worst thing you can do is give them a list of 30 things they need to do to have cyber hygiene.
Yes.
So what you really want to do is maybe what are the one or two important things you need to do, and then how are you going to live with the fact that you're compromised? Wow.
Okay. So you're saying, hey, a push part of the business, but at the same time consider that risk, is what you're saying.
Yeah. And for example, for a lot of water, and just to go further down that road, most of the incidents that you talked about have had no impact on their customers. Right. Have had very little financial impact on them, and yet they're being asked to implement, like I said, something like 30 good security practices that may or may not move the needle for them in terms of risk. So you really have to look at, you just can't say these are all cyber hygiene, these are all good practices. It's like, what is this practically going to accomplish? Now, if you say we need to get our systems off the internet, yeah, that probably is probably a smart thing to do. We need to segment OT from IT. Yeah, that's probably a smart thing to do. But then when you start to say we need to patch everything in OT every quarter, now you're starting to say, well, that's a lot of work. That might not make any sense for us.
Right. Yeah, you can't push a shutdown at my facility in order to do that patch, that quarterly patch that you're talking about.
And what will that patch really accomplish if the attacker can do anything he wants without that system being patched, or even if that system is patched? So you really have to look at what is your risk reduction achieved by this good practice. And what we find is a large percentage of the good practices actually are not achieving much. It just is achieving something called cyber hygiene. And again, it's not that they're bad things, it's just they don't move the risk needle.
Do you feel like that when someone says that cyber hygiene, that's kind of like a Bigfoot fuzzy picture? It's really just, I'm doing this to do it?
I didn't like the term. I actually did a whole podcast on why it was the wrong term, but at some point you can't fight terminology.
Right.
Right. Even if you don't agree with it.
Right.
So But I've tried to encourage people that I've worked with to, really look at what they're achieving with this level of expenditure of resources. Is it giving them efficient risk reduction?
Yeah. I want to ask you a couple of things. Now that I have you here, you got my brain going, and this is really unique. I'm really glad you're here. So I want to ask you a couple of things. Right now, if you haven't heard, there's the term called the unified namespace.
Yeah.
And you have, in our experience, deploying some of the pieces of trying to create that, truth, that single source of truth, right, for data. In your experience, there's two camps. Let me back up. There's two camps. You have this, we like that Purdue model. We really enjoy that layer 0. We've got that 3, that 3.5. We have that DMZ. We have that space for bridging that between that and IT. And then you have a camp that says, well, even if you do that, the Purdue model's dead. In your mind, where do you see, is there a place for this structure in the unified namespace without giving up security?
Well, it's funny. About 4 years ago, we had a panel on S4. Is the Purdue model dead?
Yeah.
And really, the Purdue model as a functional model is always going to exist.
Right.
It was never designed to be an architecture. And what we've kind of done is bastardize it and say, okay, here are the levels, and they should be hierarchical like this in terms of an architecture. And it was never designed for that. So, the Purdue model as an architecture is dying.
Yeah.
And, as we're getting more services in the cloud, more things done on the edge, this is all changing. But the Purdue model itself still makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
Unified namespace, I'm a big fan. But I think what I'm more excited about is both OT security products and other products are getting MCP servers put on the edge, and they're having tools, and so getting information in and out of those, whether to a unified namespace or to something else, becomes much easier, much cheaper, and easier to get the business wins.
It's funny, but now you're touching on the second thing I want to talk about, aside from the unified namespace, is artificial intelligence, AI as a whole, across the architecture. I think, I have clients, a couple of them. One of them, a project came out of a CEO or former CEO saying, we want to use Claude. I don't know why we're not using Claude in our business. And that spawned a whole set of AI initiatives. And so, in your mind, how does someone balance that security posture with creating a level of AI readiness, right, or use in their architecture?
Well, I'd say there's at least two things I look at. One is, I don't think it should put your system at risk when you do this if you do it properly.
Yeah.
Because really, you're not, if you're going to allow, let's say, controls, you think of it as a closed loop system where you're sending information out and commands are coming back that'll change the system. That now all of a sudden introduces risk. You have to take that very carefully. But if you're only sending information out to be used in AI or anything else, that's not new. We've been doing that for over a decade now.
Right.
There's very secure ways of doing it. So I don't worry about that.
Yeah.
As long as it's done thoughtfully, we've solved that problem. That's not a new problem at all. What is becoming a new problem is protecting the value of that information. Now, we haven't typically worried about that, but if you start bringing that out and allowing that to go up to Claude or anywhere else that leaves your control, if it's like an open model, now you start to get a little bit interesting. Or if you're connecting with business partners, what information do you want to do? So imagine you have that MCP server with tools,
right?
And you buy it, let's say you buy it from Ignition or Clarity if it's an OT security product. They give you the capability through that server of getting this information. You as the owner-operator have to decide, where do I want that information to go? What is my information protection policy. And we really haven't worried about that much in OT. I mean, there's a few exceptions. There's, some chemical manufacturers and others
Sure.
that have IP that have done that. But in a sense, they've just had a closed door. Nothing goes out.
Right.
That probably isn't going to even be practical for them anymore because they're going to want the benefits of using that data through UNS or whatever. So I think that's probably a new area that the information security pro is going to need to get smarter on.
Yeah, I think especially now when you do talk about that, especially with cloud connectivity, tons of cloud architectures now, it seems to be very prevalent, especially with the marriage of that, right, in the OT space and the movement to cloud. You see that as well. I think I agree with you. I want to ask you just a couple of more things, and I want to keep you.
Yeah, just one thing on that. It's not always just a yes or no. Like I had one client, an electric utility, that was allowing GE to monitor their boilers.
Yeah.
And which was great. And GE could tell them when things were going wrong, when they needed maintenance and such. And then they allowed GE to change the configuration of the boilers to make them more efficient.
Got you.
And that was great because there was a real benefit to that. But the process in which they came in allowed them to do almost anything. They basically got in there and they had a control capability in the OT zone. So then the asset owner that we were working with said, okay, we have to restrict that so they can only go to this PLC, they can only change these points, they can only change them within these ranges. So the smart ones aren't going to just be yes or no, this is allowed or not allowed. They're going to be, this is allowed within these parameters, within these walls.
So so that was my question. It sounds to me like, hey, when you're sitting down and you're looking at this, both on the security perspective, the optimization, it is not yes or no. What do you call that? I mean, how are you approaching that with clients?
Well, it's just risk management.
Yeah.
It's always, okay, if we give them this capability, what are the benefits of that? What are the risks of that? Is that something that is worth our doing? And I think the biggest thing oftentimes is saying, this is what they say they're going to do.
Yes.
Does the system restrict them to only doing that, or are we just trusting that they'll only do what they're supposed to do? And what I find a lot of times is the people offering software as a service, or whatever you want to say,
right,
the service in the cloud, want almost unrestricted access because it's easier. Yes. And because it allows them to sell future services easier. They don't have to go out and reconfigure it.
Got it. So you'd say, hey, that it might benefit, and not that that's GE's thing, but what you're saying is, hey, they might use it to their benefit to monetize something, but in reality, there needs to be a security element to that.
There does, and then the tough thing is, well, who is in control of that security element? Is it your service provider? Is it another provider? Is it your house internally? And there's a cost to all that, which
right,
gets into your risk-benefit decision.
Wow. I want to keep you here. I really do. But let me ask you finally, Dale, just a couple of things here is, number one, you've got your podcast. You've got S4 events. I know you put on some things. Where can people catch you? Where can they catch you? Is your podcast active? Where can they catch you?
It's not very active. I don't do it. I actually put one out last week. I'm going to do about one a month. But I would say the best place, either look for me on LinkedIn, because I usually post everything else there, or you could go to dale-peterson.com.
Dale-peterson.com. And do you still consult and serve clients in critical infrastructure space? Is that what you do?
Not much.
Not much.
The show actually takes up most of my time, so I'll do like 2 or 3 projects a year just to get out in the field. Because I feel like if you don't get out in the field a few times, you really lose your sense of balance.
Oh, this was great. I want to keep going, but we've got to let you go, Mr. Dale Peterson with S4 Events. Enjoyed having you here on the Energy Tech Podcast. This was great. And we're going to provide a link at least to reach out to you if we don't mind. You can catch him at least once a month on the podcast. I'm your co-host, Mike Flores with the Energy Tech Podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe. ENTELEC 2026. Thank you, Dale. Thank you.